All right, thank you all. Thank you very much for making it this far in the afternoon on Friday. We are delighted that you are joining us. This is going to be a real treat. I'm Anna Tevis, Academic Director for Human Capital Management Program here at NYU, and I am delighted to welcome to our conversation today Rob Cross, who probably needs no introduction. Officially, he's a professor of global leadership at Babson College, but we all know Rob as the real champion and the most probably generous researcher in the field of organizational network analysis. But what's really amazing about Rob's work is he applies his knowledge and expertise in the area of workplace culture, workplace productivity, and generously shares his research in very prolific publications. So we provided with the invitation to this session, provided you with the links to his websites and multiple publications. As I found out in the conversation that I had with Rob, he's already committed to the sequel to the book, which we are going to be talking about today. And what I would like to encourage you to do is really take notes, write your questions in the chat. We are going to have a lively conversation after Rob gives us the highlights of his current book and maybe some insight as to where it's all going in the sequel. So the preview for the upcoming attractions. So Rob, please tell us a little bit about what happens when we collaborate and how do we get better at it.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, and obviously thank you to everybody that's on the call at 4 o'clock on a Friday. I appreciate it. And we'll try to move quickly here, and I have some polls built in and some things to create interactivity. But I'd also really echo what Anna was saying: is please do post some questions to chat, or we'll preserve time at the end as well. This book really grew out of about a decade, maybe longer, of work that I've been doing within the consortia that I direct called the Connected Commons. And it has involved ultimately using network analytics, so kind of quantitatively mapping patterns of connectivity inside over 300 organizations to look at what are the collaborative patterns of high performers, right? So the book got titled Beyond Collaboration Overload, but it's less about collaboration overload and more really about what creates a high performer today in terms of how they're connecting. So we would map these patterns of connectivity, sometimes in groups of 10, 20, even 80,000, if we're looking at large scale organizational changes, and then collect separate performance data from the organization so that we could look at, the people that were outperforming in terms of revenue production or rapid promotion or other elements like that, kind of how they were connected. And then over the course of the past 5 years, I engaged in 3 different pretty big programs of interviews where I was interviewing 100 women and 100 men across top organizations to really dive into not just the statistics, right, and seeing the relationship between the quantitative aspects and performance, but also looking at how they qualitatively were doing this. How were people building these connections and managing? And of course, the idea of overload, people are experiencing in bigger and bigger ways. Before the pandemic, what we could see is, generally speaking, people were spending about 85% of their time in a given work week in collaborative activities, right? On the phone, on email and meetings and instant messaging or Slack channels, working in collaborative spaces like these Teams, portals where you're kind of adapting and adding to or taking from a collaborative work product. So if you aggregate all this up, we see that people were spending about 85% or more of their time in these activities and complaining bitterly pre-pandemic about the idea that meetings had taken over, right? We have 8 one-hour meetings through the day and we're overwhelmed. And as we've gone through the pandemic, of course, this has done nothing but get worse. We know studies show that people are oftentimes spending about 5 to 8 hours more a week in collaborative work. They're drifting earlier into the morning and deeper into the night if we start looking at the instant messaging going on and email activity. And, unfortunately, somebody going through the pandemic had the great idea that rather than 1-hour meetings, we're going to try to jam shorter meetings into the same day. And so instead of 8 one-hour meetings, we now have 16 30-minute meetings, and we're exhausted from it, right? We kind of feel the intensity of those meetings. We've got to be present, more completely. We're shifting across them more rapidly. And then, most people in organizations today are ending the day with a to-do list, not based on 8 meetings now, but 16, right? And there's kind of no wonder why people are feeling the stress and the burnout and all the kind of markers of overload. And yet what I could see in the work that we were doing is some people weren't experiencing that. I could get a sense that some of the high performers were getting there and being high performers by just killing themselves and kind of marching towards burnout and probably other problems. But a large portion of them were also becoming and staying high performers, while they were also scoring higher on measures of engagement, career satisfaction, other elements. And so when we looked at it that way, in terms of defining performance or successful people by performance scores, but also that they're doing it in a way that's sustainable, what we could see is the more successful people were first defined not by the size of their network. In fact, very rarely is it a large network that wins the day, but rather initially by the efficiency of it. And we could see that the more successful people were about 18 to 24% more efficient than their peers. And if you do the math and what I'm talking about, that means they're buying back about a day a week of time. And what they were doing were a set of things focused around putting structure into their work differently, a set of things that were geared around how they manage their own tendencies to jump in when they shouldn't. And this really surprised me as one of the biggest drivers of overload, because I was completely convinced that the enemy was out there. It was emails, time zones, nasty bosses, demanding clients, and too many meetings. And I came out the other side completely convinced through all these interviews that 50% or more of the problem is us and drivers that we have that lead us to jump in ways and in times when we shouldn't, that causes the overload. And then thirdly, we see that the people that do better, there are a lot of tactics that they're managing in terms of the efficiency of the interaction. So when we're talking about becoming more collaboratively efficient, it's not that these people are not collaborating, right, by any stretch. In fact, they're actually collaborating more, but they tend to be more efficient in how they're doing it. So as an example of what I mean, most people look at email and they throw up their hands and say, I can't control all of email, so I'm not even going to try. Whereas my efficient collaborators, we would use these analytics to see who are the people giving the greatest time, giving the greatest impact in these networks and taking the least amount of time. They would come back and look at email and say, well, I can't control all of it, but my team generates 40%, right, of what I have to deal with. And we could set some norms on that, right? We could be using bullets. We could use it at certain times. We could use it to accomplish certain things. And they just set team norms, right, that enable them to oftentimes buy 5-6% of their time back. And it's that kind of approach I see, that these people are not winning by one elegant solution, but by fighting for time on the margin. Right? I often call it a brawl, not a ballet. And then the second piece of this in the book for me was then saying, okay, what are they doing with that time? Right? How are they collaborating in ways that enable them to get greater scale in their work, to innovate differently? And again, we saw a different set of activities than just buying time back and using that to get into more and more rapid Zoom calls, right? For example, it wasn't doing the same thing faster. It was that these people built more expansive networks. They engaged with others in ways that pull them to their ideas and work. And they, in both instances, start to get scale efficiencies out of what they're doing. And we fundamentally can see that with that time, if people are engaging in ways inside and outside of work in certain kinds of interactions, they tend to be scoring much higher on well-being metrics and just doing better in avoiding the stress and burnout today. So I want to tell you a story just to kind of level set this. We'll do a couple of polls and then see how far we get with the time that we have here. But the book opens on this story around this individual, Scott, who I've known for quite some time. and somebody that I'd watched kind of, be very successful at a certain point and then almost falter in both professional and personal domains because of overload. But Scott this is not, him, I can't mention the name of the organization or obviously him, but he'd come into life sciences organization, hadn't done anything major for the first 4 or 5 years, but then he was put in charge of a new product development initiative that because of that success and the derivative successes, he flew up the hierarchy, right? So when we came in, we were mapping the top 10,000 people and looking at patterns of collaboration so they could streamline how they were getting drugs to market. And I'd heard nothing but amazing things about Scott, right? People assumed that he was going to be the next heir apparent for the CEO and just kind of positive things coming in as we learned a little bit about the leadership team. So you can imagine my surprise. I'm walking with the CEO to go into the boardroom to talk about how do you streamline time to market. And the CEO stops me and he pulls me aside and he said, I'd like you to look at Scott. Because he's done amazing things, yet he's really faltering in the role that he's in right now, and we're about to have to remove him and put him in something less consequential. And he said the crazy thing is, from a human capital standpoint, everything we see he's doing right. Right, he's come into the organization, he's taken layers out of the hierarchy, heavy servant-based mindset to leadership. I mean, just everything you could want of a contemporary leader he's doing. And yet he's missed growth strategies in Asia. The engagement scores in his units are plummeting and his peers are grumbling about it, right? Not coming through. And he said, it's a mystery, right? Because everything we can see visibly he's doing right, yet the results aren't associating. And he said, could you look at the network? And when we did that, we got this view, and there's a lot of ways we can kind of dynamically look at these analytics to see what's happening. But we could see in here that Scott, in this one group of 1,800, he had 118 people coming to him frequently for information, and another 78 that said, if I can't get more of his time, I can't hit my business goals, right? And this was one of 3 groups that he was in charge of. So when I met him, I clearly could tell this is somebody that's not doing well, right? You physically, you could tell that he wasn't healthy. I'd get emails at 2 a.m. and again at 6 a.m. And he was really struggling. But the amazing thing from my standpoint is I immediately could tell that this is not a control freak, right? Everybody that looks at these analytics that we run across a lot of organizations sees people that get overwhelmed in networks, and we have very specific metrics for looking at that. And the knee-jerk reaction is that person needs to delegate, right? Whereas what I'm finding is that's only the case in probably 90% of the 10% of the time, right? That people fall into these problems of overload for a whole host of drivers. And Scott's issue was he liked to help, right? He was the essence of a servant-based leader. But if you do that and you do it in certain ways, you become the path of least resistance, right? And eventually that accumulates around you in ways that isn't sustainable today. And so what he did is and this is really important, he focused not on the big things. Cognitively, our minds are wired to think about the 2 or 3 big things that are driving us crazy in our work, right? And go home and grumble about them or whatever it may be. And almost invariably, those 2 or 3 big things are the intractable ones, right? The things that we can't delegate, right? It's too enmeshed in what we're doing. Or if we do try to delegate it, our strategy too often is to give it to the person we've given the last 3 things to, right? The one person we really trust. And then we're just shifting the overload around, right? In the systems. And so the magic of this game that I see in all the interviews we've done is these people are winning not by the 1 or 2 big things that our minds can remember, but by finding all the small things that are creeping up around them and consuming, 15, 18, 20% of their time. So the way he did it is he looked back in his calendar, an email trail, 4 months. You can't look back last week because we justify everything. We're deeply important. But when you create some space, you start to see all these interactions where you're jumping in to answer, informational requests that you needed to be good at 5 years ago. But at this point in time, if you could package them and create another go-to person on it and not give it to your next most trusted colleague, but go 1 layer out. Right? Don't go to the first knee-jerk reaction person, but think about where's the talent that I'm actually trying to pull into the network. Then you start to have a really magical effect, right? You're taking the demand off the center. You're taking it off of somebody that's not going to fight you, right, for that because they don't need to be good at it anymore. And you're using it to pull in talent and build a capability in certain ways. And that's what he was looking for, right? He found a series of domains around informational categories that he could create alternative go-to people on, decision rights that he could move in certain ways, and thresholds he could change in portions of his role he could shift. All pretty small moves that accumulated to 15, 16% of his time. And then he stepped back and asked the second question. The first question is really, how am I structuring my work, right? If you're following what I'm doing, because roles aren't well defined today, right? It's all the expectations that are put on us that we allow to be put on us in many cases. And he was shaping them, right? Saying, I can alter this, I can shift, what we're doing in a way that distributes the demand. And then he stepped back and said, well, what am I doing that's causing it? And again, Scott's issue was not controlling, right? It was that he loved to help. I mean, he felt being a leader, being a good colleague was helping directly, quickly, being proactive. And that's a great thing, right? Nobody would argue that, but it can have an endpoint that's not great if you're not doing it in certain ways. And so what they did, I didn't know was possible. They ended up sending Scott to a health camp. It was a yoga retreat camp or something like that. And the way he tells the story, when we present this back in his organization, is he said the first day was a nightmare, right? And not because of the health stuff, but because they took both of his devices away. And I mean that plural. He had two that he was constantly checking. And he described it like a heroin withdrawal. He said he was shaky and jittery, and we know that's not too far off from the truth, right? We get these hits from dopamine from checking constantly, and really, and many times begs the case of who's serving whom in this game. But what he saw is one of the things that caused Scott problems. Let me set this up a little bit differently. Is that just like in any organization, he would see activities or initiatives or projects where 10, 12, 15 people were copied saying, here's what we're going to go do, right, on this critical project, whatever it is. And somebody else may weigh in and say, well, what about A? And somebody says, what about B? And eventually, as that trail kind of emerged, Scott would eventually jump in, but he wouldn't jump in and say, go do this or go look into this, right? It wasn't directive. He would just jump in and say, hey, have you thought about this? So he was lobbing an idea in. Just a thought. And the reason he was doing it was because he wanted his team to know he was there, right? That was it, right? He just wanted to know the team to know he was present. He cared about what they were doing, and it was important. But what would happen every time he did it is that Scott would suddenly have then this group of people managing the issue, and they suddenly started to have to manage Scott, right? So he would get more emails coming back to him, more meetings on his calendar, more decision-making, meetings, sometimes 6, 8, 12 weeks out, that he couldn't even associate the fact that he started it with those interjections, right? And kind of started that path. And that's really kind of the nature of overload in a lot of this. When I talk about ways we jump in that create overload on ourselves, either at work or outside of work, it's a lot bigger than we realize because it separates in time a lot. And he said the biggest way that he saw this is he got out of that health retreat and went back to his office, and he'd been away 10 days. So he's going to try to catch up on thousands of emails. He's going through the emails. He's seeing these issues that happened 10 days ago. He's viscerally feeling his body react, right? Blood pressure rise, leaning in. I've got to get involved. I've got to let him know I'm here. And then he would see the thing was solved 2 or 3 emails past when he likely would have jumped in. And it was just an eye-opener, right, for him, of the need to really develop a couple of ways of guarding against that tendency, right, where he was the enemy. So that's what he focused on, right? First is, how am I proactively putting structure into this role that'll make me successful? And then how am I managing my own triggers, my own tendencies to jump in when I shouldn't? And he moved from, the number 1 overwhelmed person in the beginning to 17 by the 6-month mark to 23 by the end of the year. And the idea wasn't to kind of get him out of everything, but to position his involvement, right, in a way that he was contributing more of what he should be, and the group was consuming him in a different way. And so as we look at this, that's one of 600 stories, right? One that I know from a little bit of a longer perspective, but one of about 600 stories that we've seen in this. And as I consolidated back, okay, those people that kind of got themselves out of overload or kept from overload and looked structurally at what they were doing, we tend to see these 8 items, right, about ways that, for example, the more successful people block reflective time, right? They're more likely to put times in their calendar, and there's specific reasons for that enable them to be more efficient, right, in what they're doing. Or they proactively review calendar and email, like I'm describing with Scott, to say, how do I look for the small items and distribute them in the system, and not just wait to try to get to the big one. So I want to do a poll here, and I'm going to ask Ellen to open this if okay. And what I'd like to ask people to do is just reflect for yourself for a moment. And if you think about one thing from this list that if you did more systematically could help you from an efficiency standpoint, a collaborative efficiency standpoint, I'd like you to select that thing. So not the thing you think you're good at, but the one item in here that if you did more systematically could have a positive impact on kind of promoting efficiency. And we'll give this about 60 seconds. It's a little bit longer, and I'll explain why in just a minute, and we can come back here. And I see one question that came in around the new technology, metaverse. Let me back away and say it more broadly. I think there are possibilities for AI to begin to shield us from certain kinds of collaboration and position us into better connectivity, right? Things that can have a greater impact for us. But generally speaking, what I see is the more we automate different kinds of technologies that have us connecting or not, or the more vehicles that we put out there for people, it's not the technology that's having the impact, it's the cultural norms around it that accrue that become bad. So it's not email that kills us. If I just go to a standard technology, it's the norms of use around it that tend to accrue that create the inefficiencies in there. And so maybe this is something we could come back to in a little bit. But I think it's a super interesting question, right? Especially as we move forward, of the role of technology and what can be done. Right now, the thing I can really unequivocally say is most large organizations, because these technologies are so cheap, the CIOs have invested in them. And they now have, typically leaders are working across 8 or 9 collaborative platforms. And it sounds like a lot at first, but you go in and you talk to people and they're working across Slack. They have an internal team collaborative space. They have email, they have Zoom, they have face-to-face meetings, they have some gratitude application. They have 2 or 3 other things they have to do that are proprietary. And it's just too much, right, across all those elements to be able to keep up with work. So it's a real challenge. And most of what I see is people trying to consolidate down rather than layer on another technology and be really clear about the norms of use there. So Ellen, could we look at the results here quickly and see what we got? All right. So we have proactively, well, let me kind of back away on a couple things here. One is, you see that there's not kind of one super clear winner, right? I can look and say, okay, proactively shape others' expectations of my role is the winner in terms of getting 26% of the votes here. But you see that in general, people picked a pretty even distribution, right? Not perfect in terms of a bell curve, but important in the sense that there's no one clear thing that everybody needs to go do, right? And so the proactively shape others' expectations is a huge deal. We're finding, especially in team context, there's all sorts of devices that leaders are able to use that shape the expectations coming into the teams. I mean, part of what's happened as we've gone into these agile structures is the consultants have pointed at the hierarchy and said, we've got to get rid of that. But as they've flattened everything, they've created these conditions where teams are getting too many disparate requests from disparate stakeholders that aren't coordinated, right? And so it's creating overload. And however you do it, right, at a team level or personal level, shaping those expectations before the demand comes in is a really big deal. Also grab this one idea of blocking time. I mean, one of the reasons that matters so much, and we just finished a big study with a couple of other companies, Uber and General Mills, and some good colleagues of mine, that showed that a 2-hour block, in the calendar tends to be an optimal amount in terms of relationships to productivity. The reason it matters is because we experience collaborative overload as a volume problem. Right? We get through the day, we're exhausted, by the time we finish it. But it's also a switching cost problem, right? Every time we're moving across things, we have a cognitive tax that's placed on us. Some studies I've read show that if you look down at a text and back up, that's as much as a 64-second loss, right? Just from glancing down and back. If you are engaged or distracted to such a degree that you lose your train of thought or the schema, then that can be as much as 20 to 23 minutes, right? And so you can get better at that, but you just do the math yourself. How many of those distractions you have today, right? The small kind and the big kind. And you start to see, okay, it's not just volume, it's the way we're partitioning the work that matters. And there's a lot of stories in how people do this, right? How they're kind of managing to a rhythm of work that is optimal to themselves. So that's one of the things we see in this work is that the way we create structure, we have a lot more ability to do that than we think, but we too often look for the big things versus focusing on the small ways that we can put structure into play. Second biggest thing that really stressed me out as I went through all these interviews, and you have to imagine they become really personal, right? You're on 90-minute discussions, and sometimes you're drifting into areas that you only have conversations with 4 or 5 people in your life, right? About around how they're managing, how they're holding up. And I would hear 2 kinds of bad stories from overload. One was when it was a surge of work that happened to people, either a promotion or something big landed on their desk and they got stuck with it, right? And they had to do a little bit more. And those didn't tend to bother me that much, right? People could kind of figure it out. Hopefully they learned their lesson, they didn't do it again, and things would go on because there was a pretty definable starting point and ending point to the problem. But the one that really did stress me out are the stories that I would hear that I started to call the slow burn, where people were just working a little bit harder, a little bit faster, trying one new technology, moving from hour meetings to 30 minutes to 15 minutes, deeper into the night, earlier into the morning, further into the weekend. And it would all work right up until it didn't, right? Everything would be okay right up until their significant other said no more, they lost a key employee on a team, or just one last thing kind of landed on their lap, and it would start to really unravel, their success over time. And the crazy thing is most times it was self-imposed, right? People would jump in Scott's case, because he got a great deal of satisfaction out of helping others, right? And so it actually feels really good. Collaborative overload feels really good, right up until it doesn't. And it's kind of a real struggle, right, to see some of the things that happen around you when that's going on. But some of the worst stories I would hear were people that have been, become completely unidimensional in work and given up, other aspects of their life outside of work and have really negative consequences because of this mechanism, right? That it feels good until it doesn't. And what we could see, again, these are not all human motives or anything like that, but there are a set of these that really tend to lead people into trouble over time that I'd like to pull on one more time. We'll do this once more, and then I've only got a handful of minutes left for me to kind of push through. But Ellen, if we could open the poll here. And what I'm looking for here is just, if you think about times when you've been asked to do something and you kind of know immediately you shouldn't do it, and then you convince yourself the next minute that this is something, I should go do, you do it and you're overwhelmed, right? In 4 or 6 weeks out. What triggered you, right? What might be that trigger? Is it a desire for help? Right, desire to help? Is it fear of missing out? A common one. I can say for me, it's accomplishment. If I see a 5-minute window in my life, I'm going to try to jam 60 minutes of stuff in it and completely ignore the 2 to 3 hours I have to do to coordinate with my team to get everybody else on board. And sure enough, I guarantee you, kind of 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks in, I'll be grumbling about why is this so hard? Why aren't people going along? And the reality is I started it to begin with, right? All from a good place. But I started it to begin with. So we'll give it 30 more seconds on this. And I just ask people to kind of, identify a trigger for yourself, and then we'll take a look at it and push ahead. All right, Ellen, what do you say? Should we take a look at it? And good deal. Thank you so much. So, and I realize these are long items, and the reason that is, so I know I'm pushing people to kind of answer quickly in here. It lines up directly with an online assessment that people can go to my website and take if they want to kind of go a little bit deeper into this and see, some of the implications there. But again, same idea here. You see in this case that there's a distribution, again, of kind of things that drive people into this in different ways. I'm concerned with being labeled a poor performer is kind of the leading contender here, where you're trying to navigate and figure out what can I say no to. And what I see in this is, for many people, they struggle because they view the word no as binary, right? It's yes or no. And the day that they figure out that doesn't have to be the case, that when these things come, they can actually say, here's the sets of competing demands I have, and when would you like this one to be done, right? And actually kind of engage in a bit of a dialogue on how do I prioritize, just as one simple behavior. There's a whole set of other things in there that start to kind of take that pressure off of it being yes or no in a life-ending decision right in that moment, and more about how do we kind of jointly make decisions that start to make things work. But it's really critical, right? Because in these agile worlds, you have more and more demands coming at you laterally than really is humanly possible, anymore. And so it's a key thing to really be thinking about. So, what we see and where I focus on in the book and the work that we've been doing is the notion that the people that are doing better at this game, they are putting structure into their world differently. They're very attuned to what's that trigger they have, that tendency to jump in when they shouldn't. And often that's, as much as 50% of the problem, believe it or not, is that there's a tendency we have that kind of leads us all to jump. And then tactically, what are we doing that has impact? And so what I do for the consortia that I run is I will take these ideas. It used to be first 10 or 15 years of my life with this consortium, all I had to do was write white papers and bring people together, and that was good enough. But with the the escalation of all this stuff, like you're competing with McKinsey's of the world or Deloitte or everybody else that's throwing millions of dollars to get companies in the room so they can sell them stuff, you find that you have to get quicker and quicker on what and how you're producing insights for the companies. And so I'll give you one kind of cool thing that's really taken off is this digital card sort, right? And so these are things we go into, these are on my website too, so you can kind of play around with this, where the items that we just talked through, right, around how do you put structure into your world, proactive networking, standing meetings, reallocate information decisions, calendar strategically, maybe I'll grab, I don't know which was the one, I'll grab block reflective time, so we're talking about that. People can go through and look at it, they can flip the card, you can open up a video. These are all 3-minute videos. Right now it's of me. We're trying to get more diversity in the recording room, but they're all just kind of saying, okay, here's the issue and why it's a big deal today. Here's a story of somebody that's done this well and what they were doing. And then here's 3 or 4 things you can do, right? And so it's a way of kind of understanding the different dimensions right in here. And what all people are doing is saying, okay, this is one area I need to focus on. Right. And another one, let's describe need for accomplishment to be quick here and maybe desire to help. Right. And then, maybe it's teaching efficient behaviors. Right. How do you kind of coach others and how best to consume your time to buy time back? And then they can submit a report and print it. And it very quickly kind of gives people a real quick summary of things that they could go do. Right. So you see, these are the 4 cards we just pulled. And then each card has a page around it, around why this matters, what you can do, another case study, a video, kind of other elements like that. So we're doing a lot on that front to be able to kind of go back in and help people do things a little bit differently. What I'm going to do is push this ahead just a little bit and talk to kind of 2 other ideas on here, and then I'll pause to do questions and answers. And I would love to. You'll see that I only have 4 and 5 in here. I've left 6 off because that is the part of the next book that's around well-being. And so if people want to kind of lean into that a little bit with me, I would really, really enjoy kind of talking about what we're seeing there. But when we look at this, what I was focused on with the successful people was first saying, okay, how are they buying this time back, right? How are they engaging in a way that's 18 to 24% more efficient? And everybody grabs the tactics, like number 3, the behavioral section. There's a lot of very quick tips in there that can pay off. But I find that only works if you're doing 1 and 2 well as well. If you just go to the tactics, then we tend to fall into this problem we've had with COVID, where we move from 8 one-hour meetings to 16 30-minute meetings because we're seeing the problem through the lens of the tool or the technology. We're not actually looking at where it's being generated, what's generating the use and the norms of it. And then the second thing I was very focused on, and I really had to push with the publisher on this, was to say it's not enough to just say how people are getting this time back, but we need to know how they're investing it in ways that enable them to scale today. And so what I could see in here is that it's never a big network that predicts a high performer, but a more structurally diverse network. And that the high performers, what they were doing is they were spending about 20 to 25% more time engaging with people in other functional areas, other geographies, and just exploring what's the possibility, right? If we were to work together, what could we be doing or what's interesting that you're doing? And you do enough of that over time, and you start to create this awareness of the network around you and how you could pull it into new possibilities. And so these people would win then when that opportunity did come by, right? Like an RFP for a client or some sort of financial transaction in an investment bank or a piece of software code that needed to be written. And suddenly they weren't responding just on their narrow insights to the 2 or 3 people they knew, but these people were reaching back into the network and saying, wow, I could do something bigger. right? By involving other people here, other capabilities. And what they were doing then is they were winning in what I think is a really cool way. They weren't winning because they had access to some invisible power structure. They were winning because they were producing a better outcome, right? A more valued outcome. And they were doing it in a way that built a network at the same time. And so that these people would be bringing them opportunities, later. And so that's one example of kind of how we saw the way they were networking. There's more in chapter 6 on that specifically. And then the second element we would see is that the biggest performance driver of the more successful people was that they were what I call energizers, right? So we can map energy, the perception of energy in these networks, and see what are the interactions that are creating enthusiasm, right, for others. And we find that if you're a strong energizer, somebody not that's energized, themselves, but that's creating energy in interactions, getting other people enthused with what you're up to, then statistically, that's been the biggest predictor of a high performer as anything we've seen over, literally 23 years. It's typically 3 to 4 times the predictor of a high performer. And what we know about those people is it's not that they're cheerleading or celebrating everything, right? They tend to see realistic possibilities in situations. They tend to engage off task with people to create trust. They use self-deprecating humor. There's a set of 9 pretty specific behaviors that we've uncovered that they tend to engage in that really makes that difference. The cool thing about the energizers is the reason they win is not because they're happy people, but because they attract better talent, other ideas flow their way, better talent stays longer, right? And so they start to get scale out of their work around them. And they're interacting again in a very different way. It's not buying this time back to do more Zoom calls. It's kind of collaborating fundamentally differently. Now, last thought I'll leave you with, and ask yourself this question. When you get overwhelmed, right, in your life, right, and you're redlined on collaborative overload, what do you think the first 2 things you stop doing are? And kind of intuitively, it's these 2 things I just talked about, right? You stop exploring and reacting expansively in small moments, tapping into a network. You just hunker down, complain about it, try to get it done. And then you certainly don't come into interactions in ways that energize others, right? And I mean this at work and at home as well. Like, as many times I've come in as dad with a list of to-do things. It's nowhere near as effective as if I'm positioning my asks in a way that engages others. And that's kind of what we see, right? The challenge is, if you allow overload to creep in, it's not like you get fired immediately, but you stop doing these things that distinguish you and enable you to outproduce from a performance standpoint. In contrast, if you get overload in control and you start doing some of these things, it creates greater outcomes that help you push back more, right, on things you don't want to be doing. You become, less defensive in your posture on the interactions, and it creates a bit of an upward spiral. So with that, let me pause. That's the heart of this book, and really kind of focusing around performance. And as I mentioned, the next one is kind of a not a hole here, because I do have more slides, but I want to stop from Q&A here. But it's really focusing on, okay, what if we shift this idea from looking at what the high performers are doing to looking at what happy people are doing, and some pretty cool insights in there from a network standpoint. So if that's okay, Anna, I'll turn it, stop sharing and turn it back to you.
Totally. And we have some really good questions here, Rob. I mean, there's a comment here. I want to start with a comment from Michael Diamond here, saying that this is fascinating, that he feels like he just spent quality time on the therapist's couch, getting some real good advice, practical. But his underlying question here is, how does it all connect to personality type?
Yeah, I mean, there's an intricacy there. So I can say at an aggregate level, like, people may be saying, gosh, introvert, extrovert, right? And we've worked with these ideas over 23 years, hundreds of organizations, where we would map the analytics. And then in many cases, we would have like 5OB scores or Thomas Kilmann results, or Myers-Briggs, and in some cases we actually did the Big 5 or other things like that. And it's very surprising. You don't see a real difference between extroverts and introverts, as an example. There's likely to be well connected in these networks. You do see a tendency for the extroverts to be reaching and the introverts to be sought more, right? So there's nuance like that. There is one pretty persistent personality trait called self-monitoring, that when you are somebody different in different groups, right, you chameleon in different ways, that tends to fracture networks, right? Because you're somebody different in different areas and actually kind of has a negative impact in some cases out there. But it's not as big a driver inside organizations as I would have thought of, 23 years ago, from what we've seen in the analytics.
What I find very fascinating in your work is, you don't come to it through psychology, you come to it through data. Do you have a comment about getting these results by using different tools, and anything about specifically using the analytics to understand behavior?
Yeah, I mean, that's me, right? I always laugh about being what is it, the one trick pony, right? I've got a one trick in my arsenal, and it's this network lens, but it's a really good pony because there's a relational element to everything, right? So whereas most people, we could go down a whole list of things, right? From a human capital standpoint, for example, the piece we just have in Harvard Business Review right now is focused on when you hire people and bring them into the organization. We've spent a lot of time looking at those people that come in and get connected much more quickly. So as one example, we see that traditionally when people make hires and they try to onboard people, it can be 3 to 5 years before these people replicate the connectivity of a high performer. Doesn't mean they're not talking to people, but it means they haven't built the same set of bridging ties, reputational capital, other things that let them scale their work. And where we focused was we could see about a small portion of the population that did it in 9 to 12 months, right? And so that allowed us to go in and say, well, what are you doing? How are you pulling this off? And it really changed in many ways conventional thinking, right? So the first 90 days would suggest you come in and you go tell your story, right, to other people, tell people what you do, build your brand, and put a win on the board or do things like that. And what we could see when we actually studied these exemplars is they weren't doing that really. They would still be going out and meeting a lot of people early, but when they would get in some of these discussions, it's natural, right? You would say, well, Rob, tell me about yourself, right? And if I was foolish enough to answer that question in that moment, then I would tell you about myself and you wouldn't care. Generally, right? You'd say, okay, the new person's here. These people were really brilliant. You'd say, Rob, tell me about yourself. And I'd say, well, I can, but, can you tell me what your 2 or 3 things you're most excited about and 2 or 3 things that are pain points for you? And I would morph what I knew to those. I would give status. I generate energy around the interaction, create a mutual win. And suddenly those people were getting pulled in really rapidly, right? And they were riding on the legitimacy of the established people. So they were not telling their story, but they were co-creating story. Right. And it was only kind of through the data that we could see that that's shifted. Right. And I could say the exact same thing around diversity, equity, and inclusion, things that I've been trying to focus on for years and would get pushed back from the attorneys in places. But with George Floyd, suddenly people were willing to kind of share that. And again, it was really different insights that kind of looked at different ways people are addressing and moving around the implicit bias idea. Right. That's pretty cool. And that's kind of been my strategy. In most cases, I'm not an onboarding expert. I'm not a diversity, equity, inclusion expert, but it's this lens that I can bring in and then collaborate very closely with people that are, that it just gives us, different insights into what's going on.
But there are some very deeply philosophical and, psychological truths that you're building on, which is that we are fundamentally social beings, right? And you can learn a lot by just tapping. But I do think that your work in many ways challenges some of the received concepts from psychology, especially these psychological types, right? The Jungian mythology. So anyway, questions here. There's one question that, before I get to technology, one question about how you define collaboration. Who is a collaborator?
Yeah, so what I'm looking at, there's a couple of different ways we can capture these data points, right? We can use what's called passive analytics, where we may be going out and mapping, collecting email data or calendaring data or things like that. And then you're not opening the emails or looking at anything, you're just seeing who's been emailing whom. And you can create these large networks and kind of presume that's collaboration. And that's where a lot of the world is going, like Microsoft and other places, because it's relatively easy to get. You can kind of hit a button and you can get these analytics, but it's deceptively inaccurate, because there may be, 40 emails that you and I have exchanged have been arguing over some travel approval or whatever, and not something that really matters in getting things done. And so my approach generally has been to focus on using a survey-based technique, and we've built all sorts of ways of doing this in the consortia and softwares that are reflecting on getting people to identify who are the top people that enable you to get your work done, right? And then to actually ask other questions about what are you getting from those people. So we know undoubtedly we're gonna, the human mind is fallible. There's a lot of tricks we do to help work with the way the mind works. But we also know we're not gonna get everybody but we're gonna understand who the people are that are heavily relied on in the system, who the people are that aren't being as engaged as much, and the things that are really actionable, right? And so that's kind of how we look at it, is the nature of the collaboration is defined really by the quality of the tie, right? And kind of what's happening in that interaction. And I look at the negatives just as much as the positives, right? So this work we've been doing on micro stresses, or the de-energizers, or people that create fear in networks, is just as important to understand as some of the positives about the people that create purpose in your life, or other elements like that. So that's a little bit deeper than how do I define a collaborator, but that's kind of what I'm looking at, right, in these interactions.
There are amazing implications of what you're looking at if taken outside of the firewall into the broader society. But I think you're just staying focused on the workplace right now, right?
Right. Yep.
That will be really interesting next step when you are done with the sequel to this one. There's a question here about online collaboration vis-a-vis in-person collaboration. If you see different quality, there's a lot of discussion around the energy that in-person collaboration creates that doesn't exist in the online interactions. So how do you see those two types of collaboration measured against each other?
Yeah. So generally what we've seen kind of pre-pandemic, and I can comment a little bit of going through it, is people from a remote standpoint. So I've been involved in situations, for example, where one of the major consultancies in DC, focused on moving from one location to hoteling outside the Beltway, right? Because they were going to save a lot of money on the real estate footprint. And what they would find in that when things moved virtual is that the informational connections, like when we know what we want to go find out, we're pretty good at doing that virtually, right? We can go find it out. They tend to persist. The things that got crushed were the more serendipitous interactions, right? Or the what if moments, right? Or the things that kind of generate innovation, or the more authentic moments, right? When I've just been yelled at by a client and I need to just talk to you for 2 minutes to get back on track, or get a little developmental advice, right? Or those sorts of things. And they really matter, right? Those sorts of interactions are highly predictive of retention in organizations and other things. So, I mean, that's generally speaking, what we see. And as we've gone through the pandemic, people, some organizations map these analytics real time, behind the scenes. And we can see that that's what's fallen off, right? The within team collaborations have actually gotten richer and deeper, but it's the bridging ties, across other areas that have really, kind of fallen off. If I can make one more comment on it, then I'll shut up, because as I went through all these interviews, I was talking, it's a different program of work from this book. It's more on team effectiveness and performance. But I was talking to these leaders that, despite all these obstacles, managed to drive collaborative results in really significant ways. And one of the things I was always interested in was, how are you engaging the virtual members of the team, even before COVID and in COVID? And I got so many fascinating little tricks that people did when they were more intentional about the interaction. So my favorite one was, it was a New York Wall Street investment banker, gruff, Italian, persona. And he said, when everything hit, I couldn't see my team anymore, right? Suddenly they weren't in front of me. I couldn't see the interactions. I was panicking. I didn't know what was going on. And he had a group of about 30 or 40, something like that, in one of the best banks there. And he said his wife convinced him to do this thing called the Friday Rose. And he said the rose, when he sent this out to the team, was just an email. And he said, gosh, guys, here's the stem of the rose is what I grew on this week, what I learned this week, right? The bud of the rose was the cool thing that happened, right? That I'd like everybody to know. And then the thorn was, here's the thing I messed up, right? I wish I'd done a little bit differently. And what I loved about this interview is you got to imagine the brusque persona. And he's saying, I hit that go button on the email and I could hear people laughing at me. You could feel, has this guy lost his mind? And he said, no, you guys have to do it too. And so over the course of an hour, everybody's responding to this thing. And he said that that simple device introduced more serendipitous connections than they'd ever had when they were together, right? Because people would go, oh, I didn't know this was going on, or I didn't know that was going on. And he said the thorn thing, he felt within just a couple of weeks, as they got into this pattern, bred trust, right? That he was hearing things that weren't going well much earlier than he was before. And I think that's really how we need to look at it, right? Is what are you really trying to promote in terms of the interactions, right? And so is it trust? Is it serendipity? Because everybody right now, as they say, oh, everybody, the leaders come to me constantly, we've lost the water cooler moment. The reality is we didn't really even have water cooler moments, but that's the myth we have in our head. And we can recreate some aspect of serendipity this way. I do think there's something about energy that's lost, in the absence of the physical cues. But I think there's other things we can do virtually better than, and we'll have to do better as we go forward.
Yeah, Rob, I'm going to squeeze every single minute out of this meeting. We have 6 more. The question I wanted to ask you is, you're also in academia now, and I know you were in business before, but using the same way of thinking about collaboration and interaction in the academic setting. I was just having a discussion with my students this afternoon about how to actually learn. And that collaboration in the classroom is just as important as just being always, looking up to the faculty member, to the instructor. Have you done any work with these tools in executive education or any other settings? And
look at the classroom itself. Yeah, very much so. So what you tend to find if you have a class of 40, let's say, usually you find that 3 or 4 people account for 40, almost 50% of the interactions that the other students say, here's who I learned from, right? So I'd actually map in these classes, and I don't show the names on those diagrams or the analytics, but what I would be doing is kind of reflecting on, well, how has the class fallen into this pattern of listening to these sets of people? Oftentimes they weren't picking the people that had the best grades. So they weren't even necessarily learning from the people that were getting it right, but they were picking the people that were the energizers, right? And that's what we do inside companies. And that was kind of, there's a whole set of things I would do with that, right? I would use this in exec ed. I use it to design the way the breakouts are working, right? Or who's sitting at what table. You can really get a huge amount more out of every cohort by being intentional about the way that you're kind of constructing that network, right, in different ways. But then there's also a really powerful learning, right, in that. For me and for anybody that's really going into academia and teaching, I was amazed how much I created that pattern. And it was a real eye-opener. We've all heard of the Pygmalion effect and other things like that, but especially in discourse-based learning settings, I would have tendencies to kind of go to a favorite because I knew I could get something quickly, and I wouldn't necessarily tease out somebody that had been more quiet. And I found that when I started looking at that and seeing it, I would just lean over to the more quiet person a little bit more, and suddenly the whole dynamic changed, right? And so I would really urge people to think about it and maybe even try this at some point, because there's kind of cool insights for the class. And also, every single time I've gotten some blind spots for myself, right? In how I think about what I'm doing there.
That's such a helpful advice for all of us, because I know some of my colleagues are here on the call. But anyway, Friday afternoon, Rob, this has been incredibly helpful to everyone here on the call.
Thank you. It's a treat, and I appreciate everybody making the time to be here very much.
And we'll definitely follow up on everything. The recording is going to be available, and we will look forward to your next book. Just don't over collaborate. You're one of those.
I won't do it. I won't do it.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you. Everyone, have a great holiday if we don't see you before that, and stay tuned for 2022.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.